Hey.
We're back.
Okay, I'm going to open the meeting. I'm glad to have a whole lot of people here to be interested in what we're going to discuss with DEP today. So I believe the plan is to turn over. And I'm going to turn it over to DEP for their presentation. Jeff, you're on the clicker, I guess. Oh, I just see it's a plan. That was the plan.
Yeah, so maybe we can introduce Millie Garcia Serrano, your DEP. She's made it in person, and I know her team is all on Zoom, but I thought Millie could help walk us through.
Okay.
Wonderful. Can you hear me?
That's not
That's
the
not a
mic.
mic, it's just a clicker and
This is
a laser.
So when we get to
We're
the
not used to technology at DEP, so.
when we get to the PowerPoint, that'll help get you through your
Okay.
slides.
Perfect. So are we good?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And good afternoon, town officials, member of the Yarmouth Water Resources Advisory Committee, and members of the public. It's really a pleasure to be here this afternoon. And thank you, Mr. Rittenauer, for inviting us to MassDEP. Since we issued the June 1st, 2022 letter, there's been a lot of change in terms of the posture and position that the department has relative to nitrogen issues. I know that this town, the town of Yarmouth, has been working extremely hard over the years. So I do want to thank you for your diligent work. But today we're here to talk a little bit about the proposal that MassDEP has. Is a two-part proposal. We have members of our team that comprise technical as well as financial support. So with that, I'd like to introduce the MassDEP team. On the screen, I'm seeing Miss Mary Beth Chubb. She's going to be our technical lead for wastewater issues and the presentation of all of the technical material. We have Miss Kathy Baskin. She is the Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Water Resources. We have Miss Maria Pinot, who's the Director of the Municipal Services and in charge of the SRF funds and Clean Water Trust issues. Mr. Leldon Langley, who is the Director of the Wastewater Program. And who else do we have? Mr. Drew Osei should also be present. I believe he's going to be present for the first half of the meeting. Perfect, there's Drew. And Ian Jarvis, also from MassDEP in the Southeast region. So suffice to say, we have worked together in partnership over many years, and today is the beginning, the reset button for more partnership. The program that we are looking at today is very solely focused on nitrogen issues, not necessarily phosphorus, although we will touch on that, Mary Beth will. But really what we are here to talk about is nitrogen and the key source of nitrogen pollution in septics. Hence why our Title V regulations, we are proposing changes that are very much germane and very specific to nitrogen in the actual regulation. So with that, we have a lot of material to cover. I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Mary Beth. If is this how I advance the button?
Slideshow.
That would be great. Thank you, Kyle.
Yeah, and then we'll make sure that that is on the side. There's a power switch. Oops.
Yeah, he's just pulling up the presentation.
All right. So and it has a one of the, what do you call it, the laser pointer,
Mhm.
and it just goes back and forth.
Okay, perfect. So this will advance me to the next slide.
Yes.
So, all right. So this afternoon, our presentation is titled Proposed Nitrogen Sensitive Area Watershed Permitting Regulatory Framework. Some of you may recall back in 2016, MassDEP working in concert with 4 communities in the Pleasant Bay watershed, Brewster, Harwich, Chatham, and Orleans. They agreed to pilot the watershed permitting concept. And therefore, we entered into a watershed permit in 2018. Some of those lessons learned actually point us in the direction that we are today, which is that the watershed permit allows for customized approaches to getting to the nitrogen loadings. So we're going to be focusing a little bit about this two-pronged approach that looks to enhanced IAs within 5 years, for NSA areas, which is a term that we will be describing and proposing through our regulation. And then as an off-ramp, the second part of the approach is the watershed permit, which we will talk about more extensively. This is our meeting agenda. I'll look to Mr. Bob Rittenhour with regards to introductions. Is that something you'd like to, I introduce the CDP team and I don't know.
Yeah, well, why don't we go around the table and start with our chairman, Kurt Sears here for the Water Resources Advisory Committee, just so you get a sense for who exactly is in the room.
Absolutely.
He just introduced me again, so you all know who I am.
Okay.
I'm John DeLiso, member of the Water Resources Committee.
Lee Rowley, sir, member. And these folks are also public officials on other committees as well. So maybe mention any other committees you're affiliated with here?
I'm not.
Some people are just watershed.
Just Watershed, that's like their goal
Designation.
completely.
Fantastic.
Bob Rittenhour, Town Administrator.
Bill Scott, Assistant Town Administrator.
Jay Gardner, Assistant Director of Health.
Dorcas McGarren, select.
David Young, CDM Smith, helping the town do the wastewater planning.
Kara Johnson, also CDM Smith.
Lou Ragazzino with Ray Pierce, we're the ORS program manager, design at the treatment plant.
Tom Durkin, also a member of the Conservation Commission.
And there's some people in the audience who I think should introduce themselves because they're members in their staff. So, and they've also been participating for a
Mary
while. So-
Craig, Board of Health.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's Mary Craig, Board of Health. She's on
Wonderful.
Zoom.
Yeah, Jeff Colby, Public Works Director here.
Bruce Murphy, Director of Health.
Richard Costas, Water Resources.
Kathy Williams, no. Karen Green, I'm the Deputy Director. Mary Holland, Executive Director of the Yarmouth Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much.
Dave Muir, from the Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you.
We also have Mike Dickey, one of my associates who's on the phone.
I can't read the
wonderful.
list now. So I
We know
can't tell
Mike.
what's there.
Fantastic. Well, this is a really great group this afternoon. We're really excited, especially Chamber of Commerce and Realtors Association. That's terrific. We really look forward to your feedback. So the meeting objectives, this is such an important initiative that we have in front of us. And because of the profound way that we're trying to make some inroads with regards to nitrogen, this is one that we felt it was important to start getting the dialogue early and often. We're currently looking to have some draft regulations available for public review and comment in the fall, and then with an eye on promulgation in the winter. However, we're here today and we thank you for allowing us to be here in the town because we wanted to get that dialogue. We want to get your questions. This is not a perfect plan. There's no perfect plan, but it's a plan that will be perfect, or at least work its way towards perfection. If we have your input, if we have your comments, if you provide us with your pinch point feedback that we so desperately need to ensure that these regulations really resonate and they don't set any of the towns to fail. So this is really why we're here. Ms. Mary Beth Chubb is going to be providing us the presentation of the proposed regulatory framework. She's going to talk a little bit about the nitrogen sensitive area NSA designation. This is going to be something new as part of this regulation that we're proposing. The establishment of the new natural resource area NSA, the requirements, the exemptions, and then watershed permitting as a path forward versus replacement of all the septics within an NSA area. The watershed management plan, we will touch on that. We will talk about the mechanics of the permit, what's contained within the permit. And then I'm going to be turning it over to Drew Osei afterwards, so he can talk a little bit more specific with regards to Yarmouth, and also turn it over to CDM and Wright Pierce to also speak a little bit about where they are. And finally, we will kick off some general discussion opportunities for feedback. If you have any additional questions that pop out after this meeting, we really want you to email us. It's important so we can make sure that we can hit all the points. Ms. Maria Pinot is available to speak about funding opportunities. As is actually Maria's going to be, Mr. Gerard Martin's not available today. And then next steps. So I will be wrapping up. So with that, I'm going to be advancing the slide. And I invite for Mary Beth to kindly present.
Thanks, Millie. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So what I'm going to do is take you through the proposed framework, and this was sent out in the fact sheet that was sent to you with the letter from Millie in the Southeast Regional Office. But we're going to go through it step by step and how we're proposing to do this. As way of background, in 2017, DEP formed a stakeholder group for Title V and groundwater discharge issues. And one of the topics was the nitrogen sensitive area discussion. And from those discussions of that group, we formed a subcommittee to deal specifically with nitrogen sensitive area issue. That subcommittee has met 3 times, and we have discussed the expansion of the definition of what a nitrogen sensitive area is, defining how these areas might be determined, what new nitrogen requirements would apply to these new areas, various compliance options, and potential implementation schedules for those new requirements. Next slide, please. So currently, as I'm sure you're aware, Title V defines nitrogen sensitive areas, or NSAs, and they specifically pertain to drinking water protections. These are Zone 2s, interim wellhead protection areas, and also facilities that have both on-site septic systems and non-public drinking water supplies. There is also in the current regulation the ability for DEP to designate a nitrogen sensitive embayment. And under the current regulation, this involves a parallel reg change to both Title V and the surface water quality standards. And there's an imposition of a loading restriction of 440 gallons per day in the current regulation. We have not utilized the parallel regulatory process to date. Next slide. What we're proposing in Title V is to maintain the drinking water protection NSAs and to establish what we're currently referring to as natural resource area NSAs. Next slide. So there are 2 of these natural resource area NSAs, and they're defined as, the first is any watershed to an embayment or sub-embayment that is the subject of a nitrogen total maximum daily load, TMDL, approved by EPA pursuant to the Federal Clean Water Act, and an area-wide water quality management plan pursuant to Section 208 of the Clean Water Act addressing nitrogen pollution. That is the first group of a natural resource area NSA. Next slide. So what this is referring to is the Cape Cod communities. All the Cape Cod communities are subject to the 208 plan. And there are currently 30 watersheds across Cape Cod that have an EPA-approved nitrogen TMDL. For these watersheds, in these communities, this NSA designation would become effective the date the new regulations were promulgated. Next slide. The second group of natural resource area NSAs is any watershed to an embayment or sub-embayment that is the subject of an EPA-approved TMDL or is determined to be nitrogen sensitive by the department based on a scientific evaluation and adopted through a public process involving public notice, including the scientific and regulatory rationale for the designation and affording a 60-day public comment period. For these watersheds, the NSA designation is effective upon completion of the public process and DEP's issuance of the final NSA designation. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? What's the requirement for these new natural resource areas? Unless a community is subject of a watershed permit, any system serving new construction or an existing facility must incorporate best available nitrogen reducing technology within 5 years of the effective date of the NSA designation of the watershed in which they are located. So again, for the first category, it would be TMDL and 208 plan. That effective date is the date the regulation is promulgated. That starts the 5-year clock. For the second group, a TMDL or as determined by DEP in scientific evaluation, that clock starts upon the effective date of that NSA designation. Next slide. We're also looking in the regulation to define best available nitrogen reducing technology. This is the current definition as drafted, is an alternative system certified by MassDEP for general use pursuant to Title V, which has the lowest effluent total nitrogen performance value. An alternative system granted provisional or pilot approval by DEP may also be utilized as long as that system has a total nitrogen performance value less than or equal to the lowest alternative system certified for general use by the department. Next slide. So what's the exemption from the 5-year time frame and the individual system replacement? If communities obtain a watershed permit that covers an area that would be subject to the new NSA designation and the regulations, then the Title V NSA requirements would not be put into effect for that area. They would be incorporated into the watershed permit. Conversely, should later on, if that watershed permit was terminated, then upon termination or within time frame of 5 years from the effective date or 2 years of the termination, whichever is longer, those best available nitrogen technology requirements would kick in again. So the watershed permit removes that 5-year requirement. Next slide, please. So along with these proposed changes to Title V, the addition of this new NSA, the department is also proposing watershed permit regulations. The watershed permit is a 20-year permit instead of the traditional 5-year permit. It allows communities to operate in that 20-year period to employ a greater range of solutions to address water quality needs, both conventional and non-conventional or alternative. It utilizes an adaptive management approach, having permittees monitor, evaluate, and report the results of the technologies they're implementing, and then adjusting their strategy and practices as needed to ensure they're meeting and addressing water quality impairments. The watershed permit is based on the watershed management plan. Next slide. So as you know, the watershed management plan is a long-term plan to address existing water quality impairment to restore and protect water quality. It can be based on a comprehensive plan, or it can be based on a targeted watershed management plan. It is approved by town meetings of each respective watershed permit applicant. For watersheds where a TMDL has been established, the watershed management plan must achieve compliance with the water quality standards required by the TMDL and demonstrate at a minimum 75% of the necessary pollutant reductions will be achieved within 20 years. And there is a caveat unless DEP determines an alternative schedule is appropriate. Next slide. The applicant of the watershed permit is the local government unit. It could be a regional government unit, or it could be multiple local government units who have entered into an enforceable agreement amongst themselves, for example, an intermunicipal agreement. The agreement has to confirm each permittee's percentage share of the pollutant removal responsibility and provide a framework to coordinate resource management relating to expenditure and implementation. Next slide, please. So the watershed permit application is going to include information such as the estimated load reductions needed to meet the threshold concentrations at the Sentinel station for each conventional control technology and any alternative controls to be utilized. The implementation schedule for those technologies not to exceed 20 years. That's currently envisioned, including a designated set of activities in the first 5-year block of time, which will be evaluated and allow the permittee to revise and implement the period for the next 5 year, implement for the next 5-year period, the adaptive management piece. You have to identify a core sewer area, and the service area is prioritized for wastewater collection and treatment after accounting for the implementation of alternative controls and approaches. Next slide. If alternative controls and approaches are proposed, a contingency plan for a backup of conventional control technology needs to be provided. And the proposed approach to include 100% of all future pollutant loads to ensure that loads will stay below the applicable threshold levels needs to be included. Cost estimates for the infrastructure and programs associated with the proposed actions, if available. Next slide. So in the watershed permit itself, those proposed activities, that schedule, what the facility set forth in the watershed management plan, once incorporated in the watershed permit, are all enforceable requirements of the permit. There'll be a requirement of an annual report submittal, a requirement for a 5-year evaluation and review. There will be public notice requirement and a public meeting requirement for a permittee to terminate permit coverage. And the watershed permit will incorporate by reference any other permits that have been issued for activities that are also addressing water quality. So for example, if a small wastewater treatment facility existed in the watershed that was removing nitrogen, that groundwater discharge permit would be incorporated into the watershed permit by reference. Next slide, please. The issuance process follows a public notice process. Public notice would be published in the MIPA Environmental Monitor and also in a newspaper circulated in the area of the watershed. And the department would also post it on the department's webpage. We would afford a comment period of at least 60 days. And a public hearing would be held if requested by the applicant or if the department determines a public hearing is in the public's interest. Next slide. In following the general permit process, we also will have conditions related to modification, suspension, revocation of the permit and the process that those would follow, which would follow the public notice process, with the exception of revising a schedule at the request of the permittee for good and valid cause, would not necessarily have to go through the public process. Next slide, please. In terms of termination, the requirement is any one, or if there's multiple permittees, may terminate their coverage under the permit by providing written notice to the department at least 60 days in advance of the date of that termination. That notice will include public notice of a public hearing to be held at least 30 days prior to the termination date. The notice will be published again in the MIPA Environmental Monitor and in a local newspaper. And upon the termination of coverage, the best available nitrogen reducing technology requirement would then apply back to the individual systems in the NSA. So that clock would start for those systems. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Drew Osei, who will speak to exactly what this means for Yarmouth.
All right, thank you. Exactly what does this mean for Yarmouth? So this flow chart diagram can help you understand that. Yarmouth is in an area with a certified 208 plan that has been EPA approved. It would be eligible for the automatic designations at promulgation of the regs. In addition to that, it has 3 TMDLs. It shares Bass River and Lewis Bay, and then it's solely responsible for Parkers River. And so with these two items in combination, there would be automatic designations of the NSA on promulgation of the regs. And as stated, this would mean within a 5-year time span, notwithstanding obtaining a watershed permit, they would have to comply with the upgrades of the Title V systems. And so a watershed permit would be needed for the exemption for each of those watershed areas: Bass River, Lewis Bay, and Parkers River. Next slide.
Okay. So this is the point where we want to further develop the concept. We are here to take all questions. We may not have all the answers because we're still in the formulation stage here with regards to the regulations. Just want to see what the next slide is going to bring us. That just illustrates what Drew was explaining, which you're obviously very familiar with, which are the watershed areas that we're talking about specific to you. Just want to skip. I think the next one is going to be, okay, the next one's funding. So any reactions, comments, questions, we definitely want to start engaging. So far, we have been meeting with all of the Cape Islands. We have 14 meetings. This is, I think, meeting number 6. So we have our summer tour, just making sure that we connect with everybody, including the islands, also including Southeastern Mass. We have approximately 10 communities, including the Buzzards Bay and some South Shore areas that are also affected as a result of this Title V change that is to come in the fall.
So Spare obviously has something to say.
A question more for the, sorry, I happen to be a stakeholder to the process, and we left that process. We all thought we would be mediated by Watershed. The intervening years, the issues that flow back to town halls, we understood the political realities of this mediation are going to be taking place for everything. So this approach requires Watershed permit. The point of clarification is, are you issuing a watershed by watershed and should require units so that they can have signatures, or are you just going to follow the towns and go to the
So our one and only experiences with the Pleasant Bay watershed, which again touches on 4 communities. They sat down at the table. We worked for 2 years solid, trying to arrive at a concept that seemed to resonate, taking into account each and everyone's realities with where they were. And we just met with Wellfleet actually the other night. We had a select board meeting and there were 3 motions on the table. All the 3 motions carried. And they are envisioning approaching Truro and Eastham because there's a small portion of the pollution that comes from those communities as it affects Wellfleet Harbor. So the permit can be very customized to one community. And in fact, there might be areas within the community where there's no impact and therefore there's been no degradation of the water quality. And therefore it's just one part of the community. Some towns will not really need to reach out to their neighbors. But if you have a situation where you have contributions from other communities, it's a good time to see if you can realize some cost savings, some sharing strategies. If not, we will work with you individually.
Billy, someone from your team has raised their hand.
Absolutely.
Mary Beth.
So Mary Beth, if you want to, I apologize, I can't see the screen. So.
Well,
Great,
I'm just raising my hand to say it was very difficult to hear the person, and I don't know if that's just me or if other people had difficulty with that as well. And I don't know if there's a way to address the volume, but if it can be reiterated what the comment was, that might be helpful.
Yeah, I also couldn't hear it either.
No, I could not either.
Okay, so were you able to hear me?
Yes, able to hear your reply.
Yeah, I can hear you,
Really
Millie.
Just not the person who was asking the question. It was very muffled.
Yeah.
So we are going to repeat the question, but in essence, the question speaks to whether a community can obtain a permit on their own, or if they need to join in with abutting neighbor towns.
As well as the watershed permit specific to the watershed,
Exactly.
which would require us to have at least two intermunicipal agreements to address the Bass River and Lewis Bay watershed permit.
Exactly.
So
So our model again, and that's where I was going, Mary Beth and team in Boston and Southeast region. Our only experience thus far addresses the Pleasant Bay watershed, where the 4 communities joined in.
correct. If I'm not mistaken, those are in whole tri-towns, for lack of a better term, approaches that encompass all of the watershed issues, not just individually.
Correct.
And I mean, there's kind of a follow-up there that I would just put on the table for the additional discussion of the regulation piece. I really, recognize and I support the idea of placing incentives in the regulations to do watershed planning from an intermunicipal basis. And the only, fear that we have is in the event that we go down that road, if both of the communities don't make the progress that's needed, we would look, for some type of mechanism that allows our progress to be singularly evaluated such that, the only thing that we don't want to see happen is we go down the road with, say, a watershed plan, and then have that turn out to be the mechanism that's used to penalize Yarmouth residents when we've made progress in our own section of the watershed.
Yeah, I totally get it. So I encourage you, and I'd be more than happy to share with you, and I'm sure working with other town administrators, what the IMA that was written between Brewster, Harwich, Chatham, and Orleans. There was a section that addressed that particular issue with regards to the need to pull out or termination and such. But our experience, and actually someone from the town of Wellfleet asked us the other night, what about compliance and enforcement issues specific to the watershed permit? And thus far, the 4 towns have been submitting the reports on time. Next year in the fall of 2023 is the big 5-year, there's 4 5-year intervals by which we look into through adaptive management to determine if the solution that was selected by all the towns actually works. But in no intention, and I'm writing this down, but no, the intention is not to penalize the communities that want to move forward and address their issues. Because part of the watershed permit is to ensure that you have credit for nitrogen crediting and enforcement forbearance. And also codify the use of alternative non-traditional methods, which right now currently do not exist in Title V regulations. So we needed to test drive something. That's what we did with the watershed permit. Looks like that's a good path forward, and we're now moving forward to basically incorporating that into law.
On the other side, though, we could, even though we have shared watersheds, we could do our own watershed permit for that shared watershed.
You could.
Also,
Exactly.
that
So
we're not reliant on another town to do their share.
exactly.
It then becomes on them.
That's
solely.
correct.
Because we did make a lot of effort to do an IMA with 2 other towns. It's just huge waste of time,
Understood.
unfortunately. Because I guess there was no mechanism to force them to really get serious
Well,
about
it's
it.
just the timing.
There was more than timing. They're just people
being
didn't want to
kind.
play nice.
Yeah. No, so I totally understand. As you know, our commissioner was here many years ago. That was a very important partnership agreement. We're not here to tell the towns how to do it. We trust in your, we respect your reality. But at the same time, we're here also to serve as a facilitator and encourage towns to really consider the benefits and how we can get to a plan that's actually enforceable and really a cost sharing approach.
Yeah, well, that's what we'd hoped originally.
Yeah, exactly. We totally understand. Totally understand. I don't know if someone from the Southeast region or Boston team has any additional comments. Okay, so what I've captured here is, can a town with shared watersheds go solo? Or are you obliged to have to enter into a three-way partnership?
Well, two.
Two-way,
Or
or
two.
two-way partnership.
Two-way.
In that case, yeah.
I do entertain that application.
Yep.
Just, timing wise, if we break this up by phases, we may be addressing our phase in that common watershed
Mhm,
sooner than neighboring town.
mhm.
We would be contributing to remediation of the reduction of TDMLs. The other town hasn't caught up yet. So at your benchmark, we would be out of compliance. You're gonna whack both of us or just
Right.
the other side?
No, that should not be the intention. That's why we're here. And we can always hold a technical meeting after this meeting, so we can really roll up our sleeves and kind of look at those numbers and the calculations and see what the various phases and how they link up. I know David has shared with me some of this information.
What it really points to is that if you're looking to make those benchmarks, then we would have to tailor our phasing
Mhm,
to that watershed, so it's happening concurrently, right? As opposed to way ahead, one is way ahead of the other, and then the
mhm.
reductions aren't really happening. And if you don't mind, just a really quick question, there's gonna be at least 10 concurrent watershed permits coming at you
Mhm.
as soon as these regs are promulgated. Just to use a local analogy, this is a beautiful menu, but do you have the kitchen to support that?
We are hiring. And again, I think we've learned a lot from the Pleasant Bay experience. We've learned what has worked and hasn't worked. For the most part, we've attempted to remain faithful and consistent with the tenets and the spirit of the watershed permit that currently those 4 communities have, because when we meet with them, the question they will be asking is, I have a permit, how does this affect me? So there'll be some interesting dialogue there with regards to how we capture that in the regulations. But yes, we're prepared. As you can tell, we have a great team in front of us. Some of the team members are not even on this phone call with different various other commitments, but our intention is to give it our all to ensure that there's a responsive plan for you. So technical assistance working with the Board of Health. If a community decides to go in the 5-year window, which calls for IAs, then at the advanced IAs, that's a different scenario versus maybe a watershed permit that gives you a lot more flexibility in time.
Is it true, Millie, that if a community has about 5 years to actually develop their watershed permit before the IA requirement kick in? There's no timeline.
Yeah, so
in here that I've seen
so-
that says get the permit done.
So theoretically, if, say, you were to choose the advanced septic system, on-site septic systems, you have 5 years, and if you decide, wait a minute, this is not going to work, you can switch to a watershed permit. I think that flexibility is built in, but if you're ready to go, MassDEP is ready to work with you. You don't have to wait for 5 years. So I'm turning over to Mary Beth. I believe that's the concept that, in theory, the answer is yes, but I would argue why postpone if you already have a plan and it could be converted into a watershed permit.
Well, the flip side is if you take 5 years to develop your permit and then your permit's good for 20 years,
That's
you're
25.
actually got 25 years,
Exactly.
which gives you 5 phases instead of 4 phases.
Right.
Which, of course, I mean, just to add to that from a town official's perspective is the concept is kind of clear. And, you know, I like the way that you've laid it out, but what Yarmouth specifically, I think, would seek is to review what our program is it has some unique features that because of the geographic, nature of the town and the large watersheds, that what we're seeking to do is to move in that phase one across watershed boundaries so that we can establish the backbone of the system that will enable us in later phases to have better access to the residential areas that need the treatment. So as a consequence, it's not going to be possible in the 20-year timeframe to achieve the full 75 in each of the watersheds. But what we feel is that we can make some progress that is so significant that it sets up the entire community to reach it in all of the watersheds. And so what we'd like the opportunity to do, I think, is work with the DEP to, and I know the flexibility is in there to do it, but it's a little scary from our end because it says, here's the rule, unless we decide differently, that it would be, I think, a little better if we could, work to get some more validation of what our phasing system is, so that the thresholds that we meet are, to both the liking. I mean, I'd rather do it that way than try to scrabble out every possible month that I can to get away from you. You know what I'm saying? That
Totally understand.
because we think we have a good plan and it's really starting to gel, but it will require, some of that flexibility in order for us to work.
Exactly. So you have a 40-year plan. We've heard some communities, I think it's Dennis, actually the same situation. And it's very scary for communities when you already have a comprehensive or targeted plan that envisioned a 40-year, and whether it's spaced out that way for financial or because the nitrogen problem is so severe that it's going to take a while for any kind of intervention to take root. I think that's when we need to come together and see how we can optimize that plan. And the intention is we'd like to see 75% of the reduction within the first 20 years. But again, as we are talking about, there's caveat for further discussion. There's got to be some kind of exception.
And we would say, I mean, the Yarmouth plan alone is hundreds of millions of dollars in order to achieve these milestones. And, you're working with a willing community. We've had starts and stops. We have requested funding before, but the funding levels are so overwhelming that the residents of the community are petrified at moving forward with it. And we can tell you, we certainly appreciate the partnership with DEP to establish, a kind of a carrot and stick approach that makes it clearer to folks that this is not something that can be delayed. But even with everyone in town being fully engaged, a community that's this small doesn't bite off hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars over just when you're talking that 20 years is not a long time, with numbers that big. So there's, a lot to fitting within the concept that you've outlined that I think that we're going to take a little bit of help with.
Understood. There's a second part of the presentation. There's a few slides that perhaps you'd like to hear. It's Ms. Maria Pinot talking about the septic loan program. And also, we're not going to touch on the proposed supplemental line item from governor's office. It's a $200 million supplemental line item, which is still works. And communities that have opted into the Cape Cod and Islands Water Protection Fund could qualify for that fund. But we are cognizant of your situation. I just don't want to sit here and tell you that we're not. We are. So we will have to work individually and figure this out.
We could just $200 million ourselves,
Yeah.
What I would end on Bob's comments is that while on some levels we're small, as Bob said, I think that's the number of taxpayers, but we are a large area community and that we have no wastewater infrastructure currently. And so part of this plan, and you referenced nearly 40 years, but part of that is just what is practical to construct, to build out the system to meet the requirements.
Right.
And when you look at the map, the bases have been developed such that if we have a couple of years for design and then a few years, 3 years, let's say, for implementation, those are reasonable expectations for a 5-year period. That's something to consider as well. So we have a lot of work to do in a relatively short period of time.
Yep.
So we would hope there's flexibility built into that watershed that will allow us for physically getting.
Absolutely. Also, as we further develop our discussion this afternoon, and Maria's going to speak to the state revolving fund program, it would be good to hear what areas warrant funding and don't qualify for classic SRF. I think that would be very important. Some communities are looking at, for example, aquaculture. Whether it's ecological restoration or design or site evaluation. Those are things that currently, you don't get money for that. So maybe we should start developing a list, and as we mull over trying to find funding sources, how can we be responsive to that need? I think that would be very helpful. So, Maria, I'm going to fast forward to your presentation.
Okay.
Maria is going to speak to the SRF Community Septic Management Program loan model.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, Millie. I know that Yarmouth participates in this program, so you're probably familiar with it, but I would like to highlight it because I do believe that this is definitely an option on how to finance upgrades of septic systems. So as you know, the Massachusetts Clean Water Trust and MassDEP have been financing the program to upgrade or replace failed septic systems for a number of years. The Clean Water Trust dedicates $5 million each year to offer 2% interest loans to communities to fund their septic loan programs that in turn provide loans to homeowners to replace or upgrade failed septic systems. And over the past 5 years, the Clean Water Trust has made 29 loans to communities totaling over $14 million at an average loan amount of $450,000. As you probably know, the Clean Water Trust financed the Barnstable County Septic Loan Program, which now operates as its own revolving fund, providing loans to communities across Cape Cod. Next slide, please. So how does the program work? The program operates on a rolling basis. MassDEP accepts applications when communities see the need for demand from homeowners. The homeowners then apply to the town for financing, and the town draws funds as needed from the trust. The loan to the community is secured with a general obligation pledge of the community and receives the traditional debt authorization at the local level. The loan to the homeowner in turn is secure with a betterment agreement between the community and the homeowner. The trust or MassDEP are not a party to this agreement. Since the loan to the homeowner is secure with a betterment agreement, Massachusetts general law governs that agreement and the interest rates that can be charged. The interest rates charged by the community to the homeowner can be used to cover administrative expenses to manage the program, and also any remaining funds can be rolled into to new loans. This is how Barnstable County's program works, and many have done so also. The draws made against the loan by the community operate under the Clean Water Trust interim loan program and therefore accrue no interest and no fees. In most instances, the loan is put into repayment within 2 years or sooner if the community has gone through the funds or if it feels that it's finished with the program. MassDEP and the Clean Water Trust are looking forward to working with communities to develop solutions that work for the community and also provide a cost-effective way to do it. Next slide, please. So in addition to the septic loan program, the State Revolving Fund offers financing for infrastructure projects for wastewater, stormwater, and drinking water. And to access funding, inclusive the $1.1 billion the federal infrastructure funding that is coming to Massachusetts through the state revolving funds, participation in the program is fundamental. And to participate, MassDEP opens the project solicitation each July. So this is quite timely. The solicitation will open on July 1st and will close on August 12th. Once MassDEP evaluates all the proposals, we will rate them based on a pre-established ranking system, and we develop the intended use plan. Only projects appearing in the final intended use plan will receive financing. And once the intended use plan is published on at the beginning of the IUP year, then MassDEP will start accepting loan applications. And as soon as the loan agreements are put in place, then funds can start drawing and the projects can proceed to construction. And one deadline I would like to highlight is the June 30th deadline for obtaining authorization to borrow at the local level. That is a key deadline that any project that is not able to obtain that authorization to borrow cannot move forward and cannot get an SRF loan. So it takes about 18 months to 2 years to go through this process. So planning ahead is crucial, especially if communities would like to take advantage of the infrastructure funding that is available over the next 5 years, starting this year in 2022. And the important aspect of the infrastructure funds is that additional subsidies will be provided to disadvantaged communities. And this is important for Yarmouth because Yarmouth is a tier 2 community, disadvantaged community. So I would encourage you to participate in the program, and I'm ready to assist you should you if you would like to learn more about the process or how to apply. So thank you very much.
Any questions on funding?
Just like to make a comment on the SRF schedule that Maria just went through and her emphasis on that June 30th funding date.
Yes.
That the SRF process does not line up for a community who has typically had a policy of bringing actual bids to a town meeting for action. So therefore they know the absolute number. Yarmouth has done that in several instances, but right now, having explained that to them and looking to try to push things forward, they are appearing to change and bring cost estimates because that is the only way it fits within the SRF schedule. But it seems to me it would be advantageous at some point for DEP and the SRF folks to look at incorporating more flexibility into the schedule to allow actual authorization to bid a project and then bring a bid number to a town meeting, because it just doesn't work under the current schedule.
Okay, I'll take that into consideration, and but I do ask that if you do have a project in mind, if we could talk about the timing so it could work, and planning is the key. Many communities do make SRF work, and working closely with MassDEP is, I believe, the key.
Yeah, I think it could work if you allow, the application to be submitted, get approved, and then you issue the authorization to bid without having to have that check mark of the community pass the funding already. Because you'd have to have the flexibility if they're going that route. And I know all your letters come out, even if they do it now, it's at their risk and what have you. Well, they're moving forward at that risk, but they're bringing a bid to town meeting, which often is better received by town meeting voters.
Okay, thank you.
So that sounds like an action item. Going to be taking that back. Thank you for offering that. And again, I just want to reiterate, during the course of your planning, if there are areas where there are funding gaps, we really want to hear that. I know some communities are using other interesting applications. I don't know, for example, I think you're part of the SNP grant area. So Drew say, might correct me here. There's grant availability, I think, through EPA. Some communities have looked to mass housing, incorporating housing projects with some 0% loans. So part of what we're going to get into here is you see MassDEP next steps. We started our communication with all the towns and stakeholders, stemming and triggered by that June 1st, 2022 letter that Commissioner Suberg issued, and we had attached a fact sheet, which is the basis for our presentation that you will be getting. We provided that presentation to Mr. Rittenauer. Please make sure that everyone here gets that presentation. We're currently scheduling MassDEP town meetings. That's ongoing. I have my papers, lots of papers, but basically this is our little calendar. It changes daily, I would say. So far, we've been meeting with some associations, towns. We are going to be meeting, I think this is an interesting one, on July 5th, the Cape Cod Health Agents. It's a virtual meeting, so it would be good to have you there to really think about and talk about this particular proposal with a context on real estate and health agents. We also are looking to schedule the Cape Cod Municipal Managers Association meeting to give a presentation at that forum. I believe it's June 14, but we still need to work with Mr. Lawton. I think it's the same.
Right.
So we're basically just trying to work with every single person, every single community, every single entity, so that we can really get a real taste of what this looks like and ensure that the proposal is something that the communities can live with. So we're scheduling these DEP town meetings, and we're developing the informational webpage. The regulatory revision, that's ongoing, and the funding guidance, that's ongoing. But I'd really like to, I think there's got to be a lot of emphasis added on that, because these are costly enterprises, and we know that wastewater is a difficult, it's got a big price tag associated with action. So points of contacts, you know how to find us. Feel free to email us. We'd like to hear from you. Please send us your questions. We'd like to set up a separate and apart meeting so we can actually talk about your town. And we're here tonight, so if you have time, we're more than happy to hear from you and tell us a little bit of where you are in the process. If you want to get closer to the table.
Jelly.
Bruce Murphy, Director of Health. Just some general questions. I was taking notes. I know you're opening up Title V. I think you're driving a lot of this through Title V regulations. which are enforced by the Board of Health. Are you planning to do any other upgrades within Title V, just the watershed?
Not at the moment. One question that came up has to do with phosphorus. And at this moment, we're not prepared to open up other parts of the regulation. This really focuses on nitrogen because nitrogen has been through the Mass Estuaries program.
I
and learned.
understand that. I'm thinking like the definition within Title V of new construction. Would that
Okay.
require a new updated system? New construction, does that just be, we see a lot of houses being raised and replaced. That's not considered new
That's-
construction,
that-
they would have to upgrade a septic
Right.
system.
So the answer is no. And I believe that some communities actually are looking into bylaws. So Mary Beth, if you want to expand upon that, for example, I know Wellfleet has a bylaw to look at the need for new systems at the time of transfer. And there are some other triggers that point to that. So that's more the local level.
So it sounds like some of the discussion was going towards IA systems. Have they been evaluated for effectiveness yet for what they're gonna lower the nitrogen to within an abatement area individually?
Yes, so Mary Beth, if you want to lend a little bit of technical expertise, I can speak sort of like big picture. But
Sure, in
Did you-
terms of IA systems, the current nitrogen enhanced removal systems with general use certification have demonstrated the ability of 19 milligrams per liter and 25 milligrams per liter as it pertains to the drinking water. There are 2 systems in provisional use right now that are looking to demonstrate 11 and 10 milligrams per liter, and actually potentially below that. So they're in the process, one of which already has 40 systems installed. And I don't have a number on the other technology. And then there is a third that is still kind of in the study piloting phase, but doesn't actually have the piloting technology approval at this point in time.
Because we've looked at as part of our wastewater planning is the number of IA systems that you have to put in to make a difference within a watershed. And there really wasn't effectiveness that go individually, where it's just going community-wise or town-wide treatment. So if we're looking at doing a change, if somebody's repairing a septic system, one individual system, and then having them put in a superior IA, that's not enough to lower, make a difference while they're waiting for sewer to come through the community. That it might be 10,000, 15,000 more on top of cost of the system. So instead of $15,000 system, it's a $30,000 system. So I think that's a real concern is the IA component of this. I don't see it as fitting in as much as going community. I think the other thing is on the septic loans that you mentioned, the demographics in this community is elderly. It's they're hard, it'd be financially difficult for people to, even if there's a loan process, and we work closely with the county loan program, looking at our demographics, people still can't pay for it. They come in and we do a pre-screen and we work with planning now. These people just can't afford another $20,000, $30,000 on a fixed income, and they just can't do it. And then when you tell them they have to do an IA on top of that, and then that's regular maintenance and a cost for operation. It's very difficult. It sounds like a good program, loan reimbursement. People still can't pay for it. When you look at the town demographics, it's hard enough swallowing a multi-million, $100 to $300 million program while they're waiting, and then they're saying, "Oh, you're going to put in a $40,000 system." They just can't do it. Demographics. I'm sure you're with that. We do have some private treatment plant businesses in this town, and they're operating on DEP. I want to say nitrogen limits of 10.
Yep.
And we've always said they should probably be lowered to 3 or 5. They have the technology on these larger units with the watershed, and we've made that comment over the past years. It is why some DEP push these large ones to do a better job. They're
Mhm.
excellent,
Okay, that's a good comment. Thank you.
and that's there. And that's an old comment. It's one
Yeah,
that we've had
it's
for
it's
30
new to
years.
me, but now's the moment.
Yeah.
For sure.
I think the other side of that too, Bruce, is that if you talk to these people who like the condos and whatnot that operate these systems, they don't want to be in that business at all.
Right.
They would much rather, they pay the money to have the pipe go to the street than to upgrade to what Bruce is suggesting. So that's the other headache. So they've been, you probably know better than I do. My sense is they've been resistant to upgrading their plants with the hope that the big pipe will come and take it away.
Okay.
But yeah,
Fair.
I don't want to be, and you mentioned the 440 per acre. Is that looking at 440 in a watershed? Because right now it's just 440 per acre in zone 2. Are you looking to expand that to the watershed?
So Mary Beth, there's a 440 per acre question.
Right, which is the loading restriction that applies to the Zone 2 NSAs currently. It wouldn't apply unless if a system was in the situation of being in both a drinking water NSA and an embayment NSA, then the 440 would apply. They would have to be in both situations.
Right, but you're not looking to increase that into the watershed area
No,
now. So there's no other, when you're looking at Title V right now, DEP looks at systems that are over 10,000 gallons per day flow. It used to be 15,000 gallon flow. Board of Health looked at it. DEP went down to 10. Are you looking to lower that to try to get more businesses to upgrade to treatment plants to maybe
I
5,000?
don't think that's a change that's proposed at the time. 10,000 where we
Right.
staying at.
It would be a good one if DEP wants to get into looking at more flows. I think what happens there is that it could possibly affect redevelopment.
Mhm.
When people are looking at redevelopment, it's very costly to go, obviously, to treatment.
Mhm.
And especially if you have a large business that might have multiple systems and only one fails, there's the other 8 allowed without getting upgraded. But I think Kurt's right, is all these businesses in redevelopment and condominiums, they don't want to be in the septic business. They're looking at this plan that's been developed by the town over the last number of years and fine-tuned that they're ready to go on all these, 8 phases. Not all of them are in shared embayments. So the plan is for these people to go forward with that and not go to town meeting and say it's a 400 million program. You're in phase 6, but you might have to put a $40,000 system in while you're waiting. And that's the nervous, the people that we see and constantly, we issue 200 or 300 permits a year, septic wise, continually.
These are repairs?
Repair of septic, people repairing the septic system. They only last, as we know, 15 to 25 years. They clog up. You have to put one in.
Mhm.
And we also know IAs have difficulty working on seasonal properties, which this community has a lot of seasonal properties. So if you have somebody put in IA, it's not going to get the required nitrogen decrease that
Okay.
takes them too long to start up. By then,
Mhm.
They're done using it.
They're not using it.
yes, just as an FYI, in terms of the systems that are currently in provisional use, they are addressing that and they are studying that effect on how to address the seasonal usage, because some of the facilities they're actually testing on are seasonal. So it is being incorporated into the development of the technology.
As you're aware, there's a great test site that you helped fund over at Otis.
Yeah,
And that's
JBCC.
still, it still has a long ways to go. I mean, they test things, but it's, people looking at it, whether it's wood chips or
Right.
something different.
That's right.
But IA's a lot of cost for an individual owner on a fixed income and a demographics.
Yeah, we appreciate that comment. Actually, we heard it from Ty and Bond when we had our meeting with Edgartown. They talked a little bit about the MassTEP Center at Joint Base Cape Cod, and the general comment was, it works great over there. Then you try to transfer that technology in a residential area and it falls flat, so.
So the town has been, looked at alternative systems probably over the last 40, 50 years. I think the first private treatment plant in the state is in Yarmouth, permit number 1, Buck Island condominiums.
Okay.
We also have the first IA fast system installed in town. That was probably 20 years ago. So the town has looked at alternative treatments, been forthcoming with that and developing a plan. So, but as the town administrator says, they're expensive to put together to sell it to.
I appreciate your comments.
So I'll
I really
save
do.
others if we want to go more technical afterwards.
Yeah, I
Just the
do.
gym.
We do.
So Bruce, when you say repairs, how do you define a repair of a system as opposed to replacement? You're talking about just replacing the leach and leaving the tank, or?
It depends. A lot of times, when I say a repair, somebody's septic system fails after 20 years, they have to put a new system in, you gotta get an engineered plan. We'll allow them to use the same septic tank, but put a new leaching field in. It's just an additional cost if they have to put a new tank in, if they already have 1,000-gallon tank. I mean, there's a lot of variances that, but we call that a repair, even though somebody's gonna say, I'm spending $40,000, you should call it a new system.
Yeah. Well, because here's my other point that I've been asking off the record, or just maybe the wrong people for years, is that in part of what you're talking about could create resistance to our plan, because if we force people to spend money on new systems, whether it be IA or conventional, and the pipe's coming down the road in 3, 4, 5 years, and or that's our intention, and you go ask them for the money for a new system, they're gonna say, I just spent all this money and I'm not doing it. So that could work against us. So my concern for many years has been what kind of repairs, a Band-Aid to let people's systems stretch out a little bit longer. And I propose this after we get approval for funding, so that we absolutely know this is gonna happen, that we find a better mechanism to let people live by with their existing systems instead of spending a bunch of money. Even if it means we say you can do this to get you by, and you need to escrow some money somewhere to guarantee their participation in the sewer system that's coming down the road.
Mhm.
And I've never heard anybody talk much about that in this whole process. But if we go NSA, that program where they got 5 years to change the system, and in 6 years we plan on bringing the pipe in, it's not going to fly.
Understood.
And we still, and even your letter addressed that the fact that IA systems alone is not going to be the answer. So we don't want to have somebody, because there's a lot of people in the community pushing IA systems as the cure. But we already know it's not. And in certain places it may be, in the big picture it won't. So I think, we in this town, we understand there are places just have to be sewered. IAs are not going to cut it. They don't get, because individually, you just talk about the numbers of the nitrogen reduction is not enough. And you don't have the land area to put them in these places. You got high water tables, multiple headaches to try to use those.
Right, so we're not here to convince you or convert you over to the IA world. We're just here to acknowledge that there are multiple ways that different communities have come to the conclusion that's what they want to choose.
Oh, I can understand that. The nitrogen levels weren't
That's right.
severe enough, and it works.
Exactly.
Okay, but
Right.
and you got the lot size that can support that.
Right, so it sounds like every single community is gonna have a customized plan. And the watershed permit is gonna afford the opportunity to, you just want to do traditionals, you do traditionals. Maybe there's a little bit of a different mix, but it may not be IAs. I think that's where the technical team meeting comes in. So we can look at the plan again, make sure that it's fitting within the context. If there's some timetable that could be realized, whether it's reopening discussions with neighbors or focusing on just you solely, I think that's where we are going to be working together very closely to get you there.
Yeah.
Notice that in the statements that we made, we are not bouncing you after 20 years. There's an opportunity for what exactly accommodation needs to be had here so that you have a solid plan that's going to work for you and the financing. But there is definitely an emphasis added on ensuring that we take advantage of all the incentives and historic funding that may come down to the Cape, and you are part of the 208 plan, you have some TMDLs that position you into the Cape and Islands Water Protection Program. And likewise, hopefully this new piece of legislation that hopefully will become reality, will pretty much follow the same process akin to funding access, akin to the one with the for the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund.
So the $200 million number that's been mentioned lately by the governor, is that specifically for Cape Cod, or is that statewide?
Cape Cod,
Just Cape Cod, the
that's
200?
correct.
That could
And
be a-
for if islands, anyone who's opted into the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund. So that's Cape legislators looking for solutions.
If I might, I think there's a little bit of confusion from statements I've heard from Kurt and Bruce. There's two pathways. Mary Beth, correct me if I misstate this, but there's two pathways. You're either going to implement the plan for watershed permit that's in your comprehensive wastewater management plan, or you're not, and then you're going to require IA systems in those watersheds. It's not, if you sign a watershed permit, you're implementing that plan, you don't have to require someone to do an IA prior to the pipe coming, if the pipe's going to go in their street.
That's correct. Thank you for
Oh,
putting
right,
that out there.
but my point is, when you have people's systems failing, let's say it's a commercial property, they're gonna spend $250,000 on a new system. And I hope, that within 3 years, there's a pipe in the ground that's functional.
Yep.
I don't wanna see that place spend $250,000, because then when you're looking for their support for the plan, they're gonna turn their back and say, no, I've just spent this money, I'm gonna get my money's worth out of this new system. And it trickles down to a residential level, but there's to me, that's an example where somebody's gonna make that kind of investment, they're not gonna give up on it too quick.
Yeah, no, I think the Board of Health had some discussions and started to try to make some policy decisions on exactly that 12 years ago when the system was first being designed. If somebody just put a septic system in, would they get a waiver to connecting?
Yeah.
By an extra year or something, or whatever it may be, instead of upgrading, do they do escrow?
And that goes back to my point, if you get them some Band-Aid to get them by, knowing that the pipe is coming,
That's what. the Board
they're
of
not spending,
Health
they're not spending the $250,000.
And,
I mean,
it would be,
250,
it
yeah.
would be interesting to see if there's some remote areas that actually, they're not gonna get that pipe for a long time. Maybe that's where you turn the conversation to that and say, what funding is available if in fact this $200 million line
And
item.
that's another argument too, because even though we're between grants, loans, and user-driven funding, right? We're not asking the general tax rolls to pay for this. Those people who aren't going to be getting the system for a long time, they're the same people who are going to say, what's in it for me? But if they do end up in an IA situation and we can help them with IAs, maybe we get that help too.
Exactly.
Because if you look at Bass River,
Mhm.
the evidence seems to be showing that the northern end of the river is the worst health of the whole river system. And yet it's way down the road for us in what we've proposed in the past.
Right.
So do we think about that in terms of,
Directing
will that
that's-
support IAs
that's
up
right.
there, or do we have to change our mind and move the pipe up north sooner than later?
So I'm so happy we're talking about this, and that's exactly the kind of thinking we need. Looking at those hotspot areas, what does the plan say right now, and can we pivot to address those hotspot areas, especially with this historic funding? So we're anxious to have this conversation. We're really.
And we
really
have,
looking forward to
correct,
that.
Jeff, we're working on the SNAP funding for Crab Creek and all that.
Yeah, to Kurt's point, it's not just the big pipe wastewater solution, but
Mhm.
several bridge culvert widening projects. We have
Yeah.
a couple that we'd like to continue working on. There's some that funding is probably imminent on some of those. There's others such as the Route 6 bridges that
Oh, the
we need to
MassDOT.
Partner with MassDOT.
MassDOT.
to
Yeah, I
get
remember
those-
that.
To get those corrected
Mhm.
and widened as well. So it's a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Solution.
We've seen, so yeah, that's correct. And if you can capitalize on curb cuts that are happening, that's a big chunk of money, and MassDOT's gonna be in the area, and you can coordinate anything with MassDOT. That will be some cost savings. And we've also seen permeable reactive barriers as another option. And that might be something, again, Maria Pinot has emphasized that if you do have a project that has a strong component of water quality restoration, protection, restoration, you should consider submitting for an SRF fund. Same thing, SNEP, I know they've also been responsive for some PRB projects. So.
Talking about Bass River Watershed, that's a good segue into, I had passed around a spreadsheet table. If you look at just the phases on the left and then the percent removals on the right of 3 watersheds, and then the percent nitrogen removal by phase, you see that Parker's River watershed under the current plan comes close. Yeah, if you're looking at existing first, because that's the nitrogen that already is here. You know, 72% removed after 4th phase is currently proposed. Goes up to 88% in phase 5. So you're very close there within a 20-year period in 4th phase. But if you go to the Bass River, you don't get up to 77% until the 7th phase. That's 35 years out. As we just discussed, it's one of the latter ones out. In Lewis Bay, you meet it in very early on, phase 2, between phase 2 and phase 3. So, you know, we could look at some shifting, but the bottom line is the phase 1 that you're currently looking to implement, nothing would change. Whether these regulations went in or not, nothing would change. So the town needs to keep moving forward with phase 1. But the question I have for DEP is the town has an approved comprehensive wastewater management plan from back in 2011. We filed the notice of project change to incorporate the Bass River watershed, which wasn't available back in 2011. MEPA has come back and wants a supplemental EIR to be filed, which we need to get done and filed by August 15th, because we've discussed with DEP that the town will get the points for having an approved CWMP when we file the PEF for their SRF program. The question I have is, do we have to actually go back at this point and reschedule and reshuffle all this to meet these proposed guidelines, which when we're filing aren't regulations? Or can the town, when they go to do their watershed permits, just put their schedules in that, which will have to be revised in order to meet those which will become formal regulations at that point?
Okay.
It's a timing issue.
It's a timing issue, but DEA is cognizant of this proposal. I think it's worth having a conversation with the MEPA office and reiterate the situation where you're in. The permit, the watershed permit is going to have the schedule that's contained within, and that's going to be the schedule that you follow.
Right.
So begs the question if that might be the overriding instrument. And then any other permits, as Mary Beth noted, are incorporated by reference. Like there's like a groundwater discharge
Yes, there
permit,
will be.
or,
Yep.
you know, that, you know, so I personally think that cost efficiency, no, cost savings and efficiency, that's the world that I like to live in. And perhaps having a conversation, because if you are serious about moving forward with a watershed permit and you have captured a lot of work and you have a lot of planning underway, maybe we can start working with you and developing that permit.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me, but
Yeah,
wanted to pose that because I'm sure you probably haven't run up against that situation scenario
yeah.
yet.
And I mean, as it is
We do have a pre-file
coming up.
meeting set up and group will be on. So
Okay, maybe we just, let's make sure that we're on the same, if it's a Zoom meeting, we can listen in and we can,
If Drew's gonna be on the call.
perfect. So maybe we can have some others also. Drew's awesome. So.
Yep, good.
I believe Drew had flagged it for us, but if, you know, we can have some policy folks also listening in to see if we can come about a, you know, process that works and is efficient in its cost savings. it moves you forward quicker.
Okay, thank you.
Beyond the cost savings, phase one has the greatest amount of revenue because it's the entire commercial street. So staying in that for the system-wide improvements, I think would be important because otherwise you start going into the neighborhoods, you're not getting revenue.
That makes sense. So when is this August?
Yeah.
We're hoping to submit August 15th for the people submittal, the supplemental EIR.
Okay. So you have a big consult?
Yeah.
With
July
Tori?
40 and,
Oh, Furby, yeah, and Tori.
and I think Tori will be.
Okay, perfect. Okay,
July 5th or 11th.
July 5th. 11. Okay, we'll be there. Sounds good. And I don't want to discourage you. You've done a lot of work. I mean, it's unbelievable, the amount of work over the years. And embracing the reality that this is a tough one. You've got, you know, the conditions are different. Some communities they have different solutions for their situation, and we need to impart some flexibility, which is why we're here. Listen to your reality, how this is going to work, and whether that flexibility can be weaved in through the watershed permit. But we do want your questions. You know, the Boston team, if they have, or Southeast region, if they have any additional comments, clarification, something that I may have misrepresented. You were still exploratory here, so forgive me, I don't have like exact answers for the most part, but we are willing to listen and make sure that this works for everybody. So Mary Beth, Kathy, Maria, Belden.
Nothing additional for me.
No, thank you though.
I'm interested in the realtors community voice. You know, if anyone has comments, questions on that score.
Okay. From the general. Which constantly feeds back to the ultimate consumer process.
Mhm.
We preface by saying I wholeheartedly agree with the 20-year permit timeframe.
Mhm.
You have to do it. So, you know, sure you weren't arbitrary in selecting that timeframe. But we as a community have to mortgage this solution over 30 years, possibly longer. And if you look at it as one of 10 communities building 10 systems concurrently on the Cape, we know we need to go out for about $100 million in revenue in the next 10 years. Collectively, we're all going to be going out for about $1 billion in revenue, which is problematic in and of itself for a number of reasons. But as most of our impression, that is a physical impossibility to meet our goals of nitrogen reduction inside of 20 years. There isn't enough equipment, construction companies, laborers,
Money.
in forget on Cape Cod, in Massachusetts, in New England, to deploy to get to that goal within that time. So we kind of have to go down this path together, and every 5 years sort of check in and say, how you doing? Because we can't postpone normal roadway constructions, normal municipal building constructions. I mean, we can't postpone all the stuff that we compete. We compete with this project to get built. So we need that infrastructure as well. And ironically, we're going to be putting all of ourselves at a disadvantage because we're all going to be trying to do the same thing at the same time. So who's going to get the sewer team first and what cost? We're in this weird position of having to outbid each other to get that contractor to do the work, which the reason I say weird, this makes it even more expensive. So you kind of have to keep our feet to the fire, but at the same time, understand that 20 years is a sort of movable timeframe into 30 or 40.
Yeah, so
None of us are gonna hold you to it because none of us are gonna be.
maybe in this business, we'll be somewhere else. But
we're
I do get
making
it.
decisions today for those folks who are gonna
Absolutely.
take our places at these sessions.
I totally understand. I am encouraged, though, as David pointed out, it seems like you are realizing some significant reductions in year 5 and year 6. So I do see that some of the percent of the Yarmouth reduction goals, you will be seeing some of that early rather than later. So I think that's where the watershed permit comes in as a phased approach, not meaning to set anybody to fail. And so there's the conversation that we can have. And I do realize, that issue of supply chain, the issue of staff, the issue of competition, that's the thing that MassDEP has heard in other communities, and we're taking that to heart as well. So truly noted, and not just dismissed, but truly noted.
Question. Who is going to do the verification on the nitrogen loading? Is it going to be the municipalities, or are you going to have an independent?
The 5-year reviews.
Yes.
So
Who's
Mass-
doing the monitoring, sampling, testing?
yeah, that's part of the plan that you're submitting to DEP. So whether it's a consultant on retainer, sampling at the sentinel wells, sampling at the monitoring stations, that becomes part of your body of information that then you're submitting to DEP. That's exactly what PBA is doing right now. They're collecting data
So we're developing a plan, submitting the plan to
to
you.
DEP, correct?
Get
It gets
approval.
incorporated
and
into
then
their
implement.
permit. So your permit is basically going to speak to how many times a year you're going to be sampling for what parameters, where you're sampling those parameters. And every year we get together, we look at the plan. In the case of PBA, they meet monthly, so DEP usually checks in with them on a monthly basis. There's been course correction, and then they have their big 5-year coming up on October 2023. So. Yeah.
Anybody got anything else? Questions? Comments?
We're willing to come back,
I hope so.
willing to meet virtually. We definitely want to work with you, and Mr. Rittenhour, you've been amazing, fantastic. You've really been a big supporter to have this dialogue, and I think before reaching out to DEP. One of the first people that contacted us, and I know that your plan is well mature and well advanced, and we need to capture every single thing you've done so that there's that credit. So.
Again, I thank you for coming down here, because my personal sense is that we should have done this 10 years ago or more, having more direct communication with DEP. I've had personal communications with certain people within DEP, but that was about it. So I would hope that this is just the beginning of an ongoing dialogue that
Absolutely.
works both for both parties.
Yeah. I'm committed to that, and as a team is committed, and we've really done a lot of moving some things around to ensure that this becomes our priority, and the administration is committed. So let's schedule the next meeting. Dave, we have a good working relationship, and CDM and your right peers and terrific. So more than happy to come back. Let's sharpen the pencils. Let's start imagining what this watershed permit may look like, and where does it fall apart and where doesn't. So let's get those questions out there. And I thank you for your time. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Really being here. Thanks so much. Thank you, DEP team. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you know how to find me?
Yeah, thank you.
We're gonna come back.
Much appreciated.
All right, we'll move on with the meeting with the OPM update.
All right, well, we had a project design meeting last week with the DPW staff and DDM Smith. And as you can see by the figure, they are in the process of designing phase one collection system shown in tan on the board. From the Barnstable town line to the Parker's River Bridge, they're about 75% complete with the design of the collection system. Unfortunately, DOT is only about 25% complete. So they're incorporating the design plans for the sewer system into the MassDOT project for the Route 28 reconstruction, which again will save, we mentioned, will save the community money in the restoration of the road, but puts the community at the schedule of MassDOT. So I think we went through some numbers and we're looking at 2024 construction for that piece of collection system. Now on the eastern side, or from Parker's River Bridge off to Dennistown to Bass River, CDM Smith is just beginning that phase. They're in preliminary design of the collection system. And then David, please contribute.
Sure.
Speaking.
What I passed around was a brief summary of the status of the three different sections of the collection system. As we refer to it as Route 28 West, which was the portion designed back in 2011. MassDOT is redesigning that and adding a full lane to the southern side of that, which was new. They're redoing a lot of drainage, so we've been working with them on their preliminary plans to realign the sewer that had been designed to fit within their current constraints. But you can see there's a brief summary there of, there's a fair amount of pipe, 23,000 linear feet of gravity sewer, 3 pumping stations, and 90,000 feet of force mains. So there's a lot going on in that section, but we are working with their consultant GPI, who's designing that for them. And the current, and I emphasize current dates because they're all susceptible to change, particularly with federal stimulus money coming. There's concerns that they may reshift some of these or even try to speed them up. So this is our current understandings, but that one is expected to bid in either fall of 2024 or as much as into early 2025. Parker's River East, which is the other end of Route 28. That is the area that hasn't had anything done prior to. You can see there's 39,000 linear feet of sewer involved there. That includes Old Main Street and the South Shore Drive area. So there's 3 pumping stations and over 13,000 feet of force main there as well. But because we don't want Route 28 dug up all at the same time, the town does not want that. We're actually trying to push that ahead of the MassDOT schedules to get that out, get the work done before MassDOT starts doing their work on the western portion. And then the third component, which is the Route 28 North Main Street intersection, which is now also combined with the Bass River Bridge project. They combined those 2 projects a little over a year ago into one. So we've been working with their designer for that project, which is Niche Associates for the intersection and HDR for the bridge. We're putting in pipe sleeves just in case anything ever would come about with Dennis. It makes sense to put them in. No pipe would be going in at this point, but they have the capability to add it later. And that one is projected to bid later in 2023, but be on a slower time frame. We're also looking at how to break up the east of Parker's River contract, how many contracts that might be. There's some advantages of keeping it all as one, get a larger contract, and then the season, MassDOT will make them shut down during the summer. They could be doing work down on South Shore Drive, or at least have different areas to work versus being under the limitations of MassDOT all the time. So what going on there? We also need to work with the folks at SRF, and we're trying to set up a meeting with them to work in how the SRF program would fit in with the MassDOT schedules. That's why the goal is to file your whole wastewater program as part of the project evaluation form that has to go in that August 15th date that I indicated, and this was shown up on the chart earlier today by SRF folks. So there's a lot going on there, but things are in motion, which is good. And I forgot that also includes the town's replacement of the water main along Route 28. So that's being incorporated into our drawings as well, which then some instances will become part of the MassDOT project.
All right, thank you, David.
Is
And then,
the- Excuse me, is the water main the whole of 28?
Yes,
So east and west is both gonna get new water?
yes.
Well, the short answer is we're looking at the whole area. There are a couple of sections that might not need to get replaced. The whole area.
And the funding for that comes out of the water
That's
funds.
And there's a water SRF, well, as it spoke before, the stormwater, wastewater and drinking water SRF programs. So they incorporate, right? Was that the plan to use SRF and use the water revenues to pay for that? Is that the plan?
certainly use water revenues to pay for that. To take a look at the timing and.
But the mechanism could be the SRFs.
For water,
Right.
Certainly, we know it works for wastewater. We know it's available for water. Take a deeper look at whether that makes sense or it's a different schedule for that. That's all being considered.
and then related to the water resource reclamation facility, really just kicked that off with CDM last week. We have a couple of critical milestones coming up. They're preparing a technical memoranda on the alternatives evaluation, which is going to identify, what's the best suited technology to use for the treatment, whether it's an SBR process or an MBR process, how they're going to meet the nitrogen reduction goals. So we'll be reviewing that and trying to make that decision very quickly. We have a Teams meeting set up Friday, 8th. We're going to go through the memoranda. Kurt, you already accepted that invitation to that meeting. We're going to try to make a decision with CDM Smith relatively quickly so they can start costing in order to meet that August deadline for the DEF application. So that touched on a few of the critical milestones. Dave, do you want to just brief us on the NEPA? Or Kara from the NEPA
Get Carol walk through that.
supplemental EIS?
Yeah, sure. Dave touched on it briefly a few minutes ago. So as you all may recall, we submitted the notice of project change to NEPA. That was that larger document you all reviewed over the last 6 months or so. That was submitted and went through the public comment period. And NEPA has requested that the town submit a supplemental environmental impact report. So that's going to require some additional sections such as climate adaptation and resiliency. So making sure that the town is planning ahead, for example, at your pumping station locations and locating equipment at the best location for the future, along with greenhouse gas emissions. And the other big new items that started this year was the environmental justice regulation. So we will beef up the environmental justice requirements that the town will need to comply with. So that will be included in the EIR along with some other mitigation items. So as we said, our goal is to submit that August 15th to NEPA to kick off that review that would align with the PEF schedule, larger project.
Thank you for flagging that, because I'm sure that the DEP will need to write a comments, meet with comments. So with regards to environmental justice, that's a big focus. Never mind Massachusetts, but the federal EPA, part of the Office of Land and Environmental Management, EPA's OLM, is requiring that environmental justice be weaved in through most any program that could potentially be had, whether it's through permitting or filings. So if I'm sure that Tori and Herbie will give you good guidance there in regards to region.
And then related to other critical milestone dates, your next meeting is going to be an important one for the design team. We're going to want to present to you the alternatives evaluation that CDM is preparing and our comments on it. So we're going to want to get the advisory committee's concurrence on the path forward. So you have that on your agenda, establishing it, but it is going to be critical in our ability to meet that August 15th.
Yeah, I don't know about the rest of the committee, but at this point, we'll meet as often as we need to get this done. If it meets 2 a month instead of 1 a month, don't worry.
It seems like that July 18th.
Right. Yeah, the whole goal and the whole structure that's set up there is to have about 60% of the design done that we can then develop a really good cost estimate off of for you then to bring to your spring 2023 town meeting. And that's collection system and the treatment facility.
Half a collection system. You're talking about, because you were just noticing the dates 23 versus 24. Are we going for the whole collection system? Or are we breaking?
Well, we'll need to work that out as to when MassDOT needs their funding requirement. They have certain dates that they like to have commitment.
Right, so I think we're looking at all of phase one, for the spring town meeting. The reference to 60% is just detail of design.
Right.
Yeah, it won't be 100%, but that's good to do, develop a cost estimate.
That's everything.
Okay. Another question that's concerning me lately is how do you feel your construction cost estimates are holding up right now in this environment?
Well, as you can guess, it's a volatile environment.
Well, I mean, I'm concerned because nobody else has said it that I've heard, but do we have to look at paring back some of this phase one to be able to afford it? Unless the magic money shows up right on time, I don't know,
Well,
because we went from 58 million to 160 million dollars. We need to figure out how to pay for it.
When we get those estimates in, we'll have those conversations, obviously. One of the bigger unknowns is the whole supply chain issue.
Right, which that can't go on forever.
Well, the new federal stimulus money put a lot more requirements on the SRF program. The Buy American clause doubled and tripled. It's no longer just steel and cement. It's all wood products, it's all plastic products, and all central equipment. Well, if you go with sequencing batch reactor type technology, most of those equipment manufacturers are made overseas. So you got to go through the whole waiver requirement and all those processes if that's what's selected. And then what's the supply chain deliveries? Well, hopefully we're coming out of the COVID period, which created its own issues, but there's just a lot of variables that have now been thrown into this.
Yeah, I just like to make sure everybody's aware of that and thinking about it, because there's only so much money you can go ask the people for, whether we're getting it through the state, the feds, or anybody else. You gotta be realistic. It's kind of an earlier conversation about repairs versus replacement versus can we wait a little while? There's a reality for the people who are writing the checks for us. So just want to make sure
we're seeing bids from estimates that we did in 2020, bids coming in 2022 that are upwards of 50% up.
There you go.
In your adjacent farms. We're doing some work on the treatment. plant. Came in $500,000. The trades,
There's
the
no.
electrical, mechanical, painting costs, $100,000 for a small pump station. So it's just, it's because the labor's not. So you made a good point about if all of this work, labor force isn't on it, housing's not.
They're also aging out. There's a lot of us that are at that age, it's, you know, the end is near. Or we're gonna retire, so. Not that end.
And now,
The end of their career, how's that? No, maybe it's new to you? Okay, so we're all set with the OPM. All right, Spirit, you're on.
I'm prepared to talk about neighborhood meetings. I have a draft schedule for it. I suspect though that the committee would probably want to postpone the conversation to the next meeting.
So if you're all right with it, we just want to make sure you had your chance because it has run long too.
I'd just like to reiterate that the general population, the residents, really are not well informed and really cognizant of what's going on. They have a sense that this is necessary and required. That they have a belief that we're going to be doing this, and unfortunately, they wait for updates every 6 months when we go to town meetings, asking to spend $5 and $10 million at a time. So a little outreach in between would make those meetings go a lot better.
Yeah.
And if nothing else, give us some feedback because we tend to talk to each other.
And I think that the Bob's trying to keep the Board of Selectmen, keep it on their plate so that there's even better audience on a regular basis for this
So
information.
my approach, if you don't mind, I'm just going to email the committee the schedule that I drafted. We still have time to meet at the beginning of September if we want to talk about it.
Okay.
At a July 18th meeting. But it breaks it down by watershed. Watershed meeting in West Yarmouth for Lewis Bay, and then one in South Yarmouth for Bass River, and then back to the middle of the town for Parker's River one, and then I think absolutely necessary of 4 or 5 for each meeting in Yarmouth Court for the folks who are concerned about paying for something they're not receiving. We should get us done between September and December. That's probably just our first go round. You probably have to do the same, if not continue with it, just to keep bringing people. I don't think we're going to be talking about the specifics we talked about today. That's just, to be honest, so we just need to keep going back to the beginning and reminding them why we're doing this. And generally, how cost effective it is the way we are deciding to proceed, even though it is expensive. I'm asked to speak to small groups all the time, or at least brief people in small groups all the time. I don't have the authority to do that. Other than to say, I'm just a regular citizen like you who's got more information. So I'd rather be able to do this with the improvement work, the committee and have something formally scheduled that's on our website that's just publicized, widely inviting people to participate. And it's going to go both ways. I suspect people are going to be asking us questions as we are given.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's the other important part is we, you know, as people trying to put this program in place is to understand what the general population's questions are. We think we know, but we don't know what they're thinking or what they want. So the fact that they're going to ask questions back is going to be huge for us. So, all right, I appreciate you doing that. We'll get that worked out. I don't see anybody from the Friends of Bass River.
Mr. Chair, at any moment, for whatever reason, any reason, you feel as though MassDEP's commissioner would be helpful. I know he would be. He's been to this community in the past. And that's exactly why he's sort of deploying this team to sort of understand which areas might need a little bit more extra assistance in any way.
Yeah.
It'd be my pleasure to communicate that to Commissioner Sewer, and I know he was just out in Wellfleet last week. So.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, because I think between staff and the CDM Smith, everybody that get together with in one room or online, whatever it may be, is very helpful. If there's any questions about what your role is, what you question, what we're doing, everybody knows.
Just let us know.
Very good. We don't have any meeting, that's correct? Oh, I must have missed it or something. You say like April 11th? Thanks. Got the wrong email. Is it anybody here to make a motion to approve the minutes? So moved. And do I have a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the minutes? I guess I have to do roll call with somebody on Zoom. So myself, I, John,
Aye.
Spiro,
Aye.
George way back
Aye.
there.
Aye.
Mary,
Aye.
okay, we're set on minutes. I think that's it, right? Okay. For now, we'll set the 18th unless somebody tells me we need to do differently.
We have a Board of Health meeting on the 18th here.
Okay. Well, we usually meet upstairs. We just did this because we had so many people today. So we don't have to interfere with your meeting.
June 18th.
July 18th.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think there's a number of things that our consultant team has put together for
Yeah.
that. So I think that's appropriate timeframe for that. But just to
Yes.
give a little preview of what that's going to look like, there's the technology is probably the biggest the treatment technology is probably the biggest design component. As you mentioned before, there'll be a report recommendation for committee consideration. That's really the type of level of discussion and decisions that we'll need. Inclusion of septic is another major cost component that they need to weigh in on. We'll have recommendation for all these items. And then if something as simple as the name, what we calling this facility, there's a recommendation that was on your agenda here, water resource reclamation facility. Wastewater treatment facility. That's more of an older name. If you need that committee support, what we're calling this treatment facility. So there's probably a couple of other things I'm missing as well, but that July 18th meeting will be important to have all those types of discussions.
And then maybe I see for the next agenda, the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund. Maybe we have a better idea of the extra funding that potentially is out there by then.
Potentially, we certainly can give the committee an update of what was done just recently with the awards to other communities. We look forward to for next year.
We covered everything. Anybody got anything else?
Just on the 200 million proposed funding, you probably know it's House Bill 4802.
Painting budget.
That's right. That means call your legislatures. Okay. Motion to adjourn. What took you so long? Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Very good. Thank you all.